I have the recording, and I think I mentioned briefly last week, is this is a persistent uh issue for me, and I've taught online now for like since the pandemic, and I still need a student to remind me every single time. Every single
Now
time.
you figure out how to use AI to automatically read your mind and turn it on.
Yes, but can AI talk about the Ludmila Moid, which is
No,
what we're going to talk about today?
just to do the turning on the machine.
Okay.
No idea what that is.
Yeah, it's some heavy duty Yiddish there. Okay, everyone, hold on one second. I'm going to share the screen with you. Give me a moment here.
Silence button on it. You want this chair?
I like this.
Okay, hold on. And everyone online can see this, right?
I'm facing the wrong way.
Yes, Harry.
If you're online, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, cool. Okay, hi, Bob. Come on in. All right, so we'll go ahead and begin. If you're online and you have questions, put them in the chat, and Sarah is keeping an eye on the chat and will stop me with questions. So we're going to sort of continue off what we were talking about last week. So that is to say, we are still, because of choir rehearsal and also the carpets being cleaned in the social hall, we're deviating a little bit from the specific curriculum of the course, which is Messianic Judaism. We will come back to that next week when the other half of our class who's in choir are here. So last week we talked about Shabtai Zvi, and hey, wow, good to see both of you. It's cool. All right, so what I was just explaining that, so we were talking, so oftentimes what we talk about so far in this class is about Messianic Judaism, and like its place in the American social fabric. But because half the class is in choir, we are sort of deviating a little bit. We talked about Shabtai Zvi, who was the failed Jewish Messiah of the 17th century last week. And this week we're going to talk briefly about another failed Jewish Messiah, Jacob Frank, and then talk about a very fascinating, charismatic Rebbe, actually, who actually was a woman, right? Her name was Hannah Rochel, and she's referred to as Ludmila Moid, which means the maid of Ludmir. And I think that'll be some really interesting stuff to finish this side conversation. And then next week, we'll jump back into talking about Messianic Jews. All right. So I want to start with, and if you're just coming in this week, then we talked a little bit about the historical context of Shabtai Zvi and how his movement, the Sabbatean movement, emerged out of the tumultuousness of the Inquisition and the expulsions, and of the Chmielnicki pogroms, and just all of the expulsions throughout Europe that leads to this false Messiah. And when he eventually fails and converts to Islam, and his followers either leave or convert or just become disaffected, there are still Sabbateans who continue on with his mission, and their work and all of the fallout from the failure of Shabtai Zvi, which is to say, this Messiah who we thought was the Messiah is not real. So what do we do about this? And some of the fallout includes the Reform movement, right? Eventually, a couple hundred years later, is the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment, and out of that comes these Jews, which were part of their history, which is to say, you know what, the Messiah, as far as we're concerned, if the Messiah is coming, great, but doesn't look like it's going to happen. Maybe this is mythology. So that's a fallout from this movement. But there are other fallout as well. And some of the fallout is the rise of these questions. And I use the term Jewish questions provocatively, because the Jewish question was a Gentile phrase to ask, what are we as Gentiles to do about the Jews in Europe, and to a lesser degree the Middle East, primarily in Europe. But the thing is, and oftentimes that resulted in disenfranchisement, it resulted in ethnic cleansing, and it results in a genocide, it results in the Holocaust. But Jews were asking these questions as well, because the emancipation, well, first of all, the failure of Shabtai Zvi and other prophets, and then the subsequent emancipation and giving of rights to Jews in Europe are going to, European Jews are going to ask these same questions. Who are we as a people? Are we this traditional Orthodox type of religion, or are we a civilization, which is kind of what the Reconstructionists and some of the reformers ask? Where do we belong? Do we belong in the shtetl, in the village? Do we belong in our own insular communities, or do we belong as just one more faith in the tapestry of the faiths of Europe, right? Where should we go if we are kicked out of the Pale of Settlement, which is Eastern Europe? Do we go to then what is called Palestine, or do we go to America, or do we go somewhere else in Europe? Should we assimilate? If we do assimilate, how much do we take on? And this is that one is a question that we ask ourselves still. We're still asking this, right? And so all of these are questions that Jews are asking themselves, and there are a multitude of answers that end up over the course of this 300-year period being put forth. And one of those answers is the Reform movement. Other answers are the Hasidic movement. Other answers eventually will be Zionism, right? These are all sorts of answers that are being put forth. But one of these answers that I find really particularly interesting are a bunch of charismatic movements, right? We should follow another charismatic leader. So Shabtai Zvi was a failed messiah, and he completely let us down. And like he didn't even have the good graces to be a martyr, right? He has to go and convert, and everyone's bummed out about it. But in his place come a number of other individuals, some of them referred to as Sabbateans, and Jacob Frank is who we'll talk about, but others like the Baal Shem Tov, like doesn't really follow Shabtai Zvi, but Shabtai Zvi brings about this renewed interest in mysticism. So Baal Shem Tov, it becomes fascinated with mysticism and starts the Hasidic movement, right? So pretty much everything that happens after Zvi within European Jewish history in particular is a direct result of his failed messianism, and also a direct result of the expulsion from Spain and the Chmielnicki pogroms. All of these things go hand in hand. Okay. There we go. So one of the Jewish answers to this is apostasy or heterodoxy. So following in the footsteps of Shabtai Zvi. So we'll talk a little bit about Jacob Frank, and there's his school of thought called Frankism. It's referred to as Frankism. So he is born, so Shabtai Zvi was Sephardi, right? And he takes followers from across the Jewish world who are Sephardi, who are Ashkenazi, like everywhere in between. But ultimately, even though he draws thousands of Ashkenazi followers who end up picking up and going into Turkey, Smyrna, and then eventually to Svat. Even though he draws thousands of Ashkenazi followers, his movement is essentially a heterodox Sephardi Judaism. Jacob Frank and Frank's family, they're Ashkenazi Jews, but they end up falling in with Shabtai Zvi. So after Shabtai Zvi converts to Islam and the movement falls apart, and Jewish orthodoxy reasserts itself as being like the standard normative way to practice Judaism, there are numbers of Jews who continue to secretly follow Shabtai Zvi. And there will be rumors, and to be called a Sabbatean is like a pejorative. So there will be rumors if you don't, for instance, the Haredi non-Hasidic Orthodox Jews at the time were very fond of referring to the new Hasidic movement as being Sabbatean, right? And saying, oh, you're not doing Judaism the right way. You must be a follower of Shabtai Zvi. And so it's this pejorative insult that's kicked around all the time, pretty much. But the fact of the matter is that there were secret followers of Shabtai Zvi. There were absolutely Sabbateans who, some of them are openly followers, like the Donna, who we talked about last week, and some of them are, really kind of quiet about it. And Jacob Frank's family is one of those. So he's born in 1726 in middle-class Poland to parents and grandparents who followed Shabtai Zvi. parents and grandparents who followed the Sabbatean movement, and they did it in secret. So there were like secret groups of Sabbatean Jews who would get together and practice Shabtai Zvi's heterodox way of conducting Judaism. And so Frank initially, he's raised in this Sabbatean family in Poland, but he ends up moving eastward and he studies with Sabbateans who are in like Eastern Europe, and he ends up in the part of Eastern Europe that's controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and he ends up initially converting to Islam. But while he is practicing Muslim, he also was still practicing Shabtai Zvi's form of Judaism. He actually develops, and this comes from mystical beliefs and Jewish mystical beliefs and mysticism, which is still part of some Jewish mysticism today. He ends up taking on a belief in reincarnation, right? So I mentioned last week, and if you weren't here last week, there's a belief in Judaism, sort of a mystical Judaism called Gilgul, which means essentially that our souls, when we die, go to this station, this place of purification, right? Which can sort of be roughly, like in terms of what happens there, it's roughly similar to a Catholic purgatory. But basically the idea is that our souls are cleansed, and then our souls are sent back into the world, into a new body. And in Hasidic Judaism, there's an idea that especially in like Chabad, Lubavitcher Judaism, there's an idea that every single Jew in history their soul has to fulfill every single one of the 613 mitzvot. And so if you don't do them all in one lifetime, you're going to come back in another life. So that idea of reincarnation probably has roots in Sufism, which has roots in Hindu and Buddhist ideas. So there's actually a historical arc there, which is really interesting. Any event, Frank he fell in with this idea of Gilgul, this idea of reincarnation, but rather than just saying, oh, we're all going to come back and keep practicing mitzvot, because when we do that, the Messiah will come, which is what Chabad believes, or many Chabadniks believe. He said, no, actually, I'm the reincarnation of Shabtai Zvi. And so this is really fascinating. As a scholar of religious studies who particularly is interested in new religious movements, this is a sort of thing that happens quite a bit, where a leader of a new religious movement says, I'm the reincarnation of some other like figure, right? So for instance, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, how many new religious movement founders said they're the reincarnation of Jesus or something like that? That's a relatively common thing in order to create a degree of theological legitimacy. Yeah, it's a way to create legitimacy. Exactly. So Frank does this. He says that he's the reincarnation of Shabtai Zvi, and at that point, he actually moves out of like traditional Islam, which is what he was ostensibly practicing, back into Sabbateanism, and he promotes what he calls Avera Lishma, which means purification through transgression. So if you'll remember, Shabtai Zvi engaged in what is referred to as antinomianism. Antinomianism means breaking the law for either the sake of breaking the law or because like you'll have some sort of spiritual awakening if you break the law. And in Shabtai Zvi's case, breaking the law meant breaking halacha, and breaking halacha meant, again, for his time and place, it meant allowing women to come up for aliyah, which is completely standard and normal now. That wasn't the case then. It meant reading from a chumash, or like basically like a Torah commentary, rather than reading from the Torah. And it meant doing work on Shabbat, which, like, as Reformed Jews, we all do these things. For Jacob Frank, what this meant was desecrating the Sabbath, right? Not just working on the Sabbath, but engaging in hedonistic behavior on the Sabbath, specifically engaging in like orgies, right? So his followers would engage in these strange, like what today we would call almost occult rites, and would also engage in like what we would maybe call non-normative sexuality, right? And so the entire Jewish community is scandalized by Frank. It's like a really, really big deal. And he's and it basically are coming out against him and saying, you're a problem. You cannot be part of the Jewish community. You are this giant shanda, this giant scandal, right? So what ends up happening? Well, they do a really interesting strategy in terms of gaining legitimacy. They have no legitimacy with the mainstream Jewish community. They are increasingly losing legitimacy with the, we want to call it more standard Sabbateans, right? People are not accepting the Frankist movement as being a legitimate Jewish movement. So what he says, well, throws up his hands, we're not Jewish, we're not rabbinic Jews, we're not Zoroastrian, Zoharistic Jews, meaning, and what he says, meaning we don't follow the Talmud, we follow the Zohar. So we follow the Kabbalah, basically. We're Kabbalists. We're not rabbinic Jews. We're not interested in Mishnah and Gemara. We're interested in something holier than that, something more mystical. And the interesting thing about the Zohar is it is very much focused on the spiritual component of Torah, and the mystical component, which has a very spiritualist element to it, as opposed to the Talmud, which is very often like focused on what do you do with this dish that is no longer kosher, right? That's not the Zohar. That's not the case. The Zohar is very much about like high mysticism. And because it's about high mysticism and elevating the spirit above the body, it resonates more with Christians. And so Jacob Frank very astutely realized that if he wasn't going to be embraced by the Jewish community, he realized that the Christian community might embrace him. And that's exactly what happened. So he goes and he seeks sanctuary with a Polish priest, and the Polish priest and other Polish Christians, other Polish Catholics embrace the Frankist movement and basically say, tone down like the weird stuff, right? But we're on board with you, and what you should do is you should have what's called a disputation, which was basically a debate on what religion is better, Christianity or Judaism. But in this case, it was a debate on what type of Judaism is better, the Zohar or the Talmud, Zoharistic or rabbinic. And they have this debate, and ultimately the church rules that the authentic Judaism is the Zoharistic Judaism, and then they go on a Talmud burning campaign where they collect like thousands of Talmuds, copies of Talmud, and burn them, right? Not at the behest, but like to the approval of the Frankists, who are okay with this, right? And at 10,000 copies of the Talmud burned because of this.
And this is only happening right around Poland.
Yes, this is only so as opposed to Shabtai Zvi, who just the entire, not even the entire world is aware of him. The entire Jewish world is waiting to see if he's the Messiah. This guy is like a footnote to that. It's only really in Poland, but still, this is devastating. This is a devastating thing to happen to the Polish Jewish community, who loses. They're obscured by the screen, but there's like a couple copies of the Talmud back there. There's one up there too. 10,000 of those just up in flames.
So there's not a question in the chat, but Lance Pinkham did make the comment of don't mess with the Zohar.
Don't mess with that. Was, I mean, from the church's perspective, don't mess with the Zohar, right? So eventually he ends up converting to Christianity itself. He becomes Roman Catholic, and 500 of his followers convert along with him. But once he becomes Catholic, the choir, you can hear them. Yeah. Once he becomes Catholic, he continues with his antinomian stuff. He continues with the orgies. He continues by saying that the Catholic Church now is incorrect. And at that point, the church has had enough with him. Similar to how the Sultan has, in the Ottoman Empire, has had enough with Shabtai Zvi, who continues to preach Sabbatianism and is not following Orthodox Islam. So he gets run out of town and he dies in obscurity in Western, or like somewhere, no, in the Balkans. Same thing happens with Frank. He's run out of the church, but he doesn't die in obscurity. He actually has followers who sort of attend him on his deathbed, and his movement will actually continue into the early 1900s. Daryl.
This doesn't seem like a religious issue. It seems like a political issue. Why would a guy go from being Jewish? We can argue all day how far out and crazy things, then becomes Christian, which is clearly different sides of the whole different philosophy, not even related. And then he's run out of that. This is like But this is pure dissertation
Well,
politics.
What did they figure when they decided in favor, did they think, well, we're gonna get some more Christians, right?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
the churches, so that's a similar, so yeah, why was it? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's both religious and political.
Look, they got 500
Yeah.
for sure.
It's religious and political, but like there's, if you've been in my classes enough, you know that it's really hard to separate these different social streams: religion and politics, religion and culture, religion and race, religion and gender. These all go hand in hand, right? It's really hard to sort of like unravel that. But yeah, it was political, but also there was a religious component. I mean, remember with Shabtai Zvi, the Sultan's dealings with him, the idea is that, okay, if we make him convert, he won't become a martyr. And if his followers become Muslim, yay, that's amazing. And if they don't become Muslim, well, at least they're not going to rise up against us, right? And it was sort of in between. The same thing is happening with Frank. The Catholic Church is like, if he becomes, in Poland, if he becomes Catholic, then hopefully he'll get some followers, but at the very least, he won't turn into another Shabtai Zvi. In this case, it was, only about 500 followers, whereas you had about 10,000 of Shabtai Zvi's followers who become Muslim.
So when it also, I want to ask, it says the church decided in favor, just the church in Poland or from Rome?
So this would have been just the church in Poland. At this point, the individual churches in each country are, I mean, they're still in communion with Rome and the Catholic Church, and that's still the case today. But the actual, like, the Vatican itself didn't have the degree of political power in 1757 as it had 250 years earlier when Henry VIII breaks away. Yeah. Sarah.
Blaine also makes the comment that it seems as if it's his Messiah complex.
So it seems as if he's a Messiah. So, he calls himself a Messiah, right? He says he's the reincarnation of Shabtai Zvi, who called himself the Messiah. So yeah, I mean, if someone calls himself the Messiah, you can pathologize it, and that's often what's done. Later on in the course, when we talk a little bit more about other more contemporary Jewish new religious movements, we can problematize the idea of like a Messiah complex a little bit. But yeah, did he think he was did Frank think he was the Messiah? I don't know if he actually thought it. I think Zvi did, but I don't know if Frank did, but his followers did. So, anyway, okay. Let's move on. So I actually want to spend a little more time talking about what I think is frankly a more frankly. I think that, and I think this is a good aspect of Jewish history to discuss before next week when we jump back into talking about contemporary messianic movements in America. This particular individual, the Maiden of Ludmir, the Ludmira Moed, the maiden, that means the Maiden of Ludmir in Yiddish. Her name was Chana Rochel Vermacher, oftentimes just referred to as Chana Rochel. And I think her story is really, frankly, more interesting than these other two guys. I know, right? I said I'm Catholic. He's the Messiah. So yeah, what do we have here? She doesn't claim. So Chana Rochel doesn't claim to be the Messiah, but she is a charismatic leader. And she's a charismatic leader who takes on a role that very few women will, actually, in this case, no other women take on, which is that of a Hasidic Rebbe, right? So not just a rabbi, but a Hasidic Rebbe. So when you think about like the first female rabbis, we talk about Regina Jonas, who was ordained as like within the progressive movement in Germany, which was the German version of the Reform movement, and tragically, horrendously died in Auschwitz. We talk about Sally Priesand, who was ordained, the first American woman to be ordained as a rabbi, right? And that's in 1972, I want to say. But before that, you have a number of others. You have Asnat Barzani, who is Sephardi, and she is She becomes a rabbi, I want to say in like the 1400s in Baghdad. And then there is the Maiden of Ludmir, right? Who's not actually ordained, but from a functional standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, she ends up doing exactly the same things that a Hasidic Rebbe in the 18th century would have done, which is really fascinating.
Sean, why did they say Rebbe and not rabbi for Hasidim like that?
Yeah. So it's a sign of like, I don't know like my understanding is it's a sign of like extreme respect. It's more than just a rabbi. It's like a rabbi of rabbis. A Rebbe almost has a royal component to them, and this is especially the case in the 19th and 18th centuries, where especially when they take on actual components of having a dynasty and holding court and things like that.
Because
So-
the vibe goes by, that's the
Yeah,
Rebbe, right?
yeah. And then with Menachem Mendel Schneerson, right? It's the Rebbe. Yeah, absolutely. What's that?
Lance, made a comment in the chat.
Uh-huh.
Saying that his understanding that the kind of came from Cohen, thought about the priests.
Kana?
Yeah, Donna came from Cohen.
I think my understanding is that it's just the Yiddish pronunciation of Hana. I think, but I could be the case. I could be wrong about that. But I thought my understanding is that Hana as a female first name is just a very Eastern Yiddish pronunciation of Hana. But but like beyond that, I don't know. That could very much be the case. All right, so interesting person, Hana Rachel. She's born in this little village called Volodymyr in Ukraine, in modern day Ukraine. This is in northwestern Ukraine, so further west than Lvov. We all know Ukrainian history or geography now, because of what's going on there. And basically, and she is born under, we might say, the political power of the Rebbe of Chernobyl, right? Now, she's really born under the political power of the Tsar, right? That's who's really in charge. But within the Jewish world, you have these different dynasties that control various regions of Jewish life, and the Rebbe of Chernobyl is the one who's in charge of where she where she grows up and lives. She dies in Jerusalem. She makes Aliyah, which is part of her interesting story. She has a fascinating marriage history about like failed betrothals, and then a really interesting. We'll get to this. A really interesting and very brief marriage. That happens at the behest of the Rebbe. And what's really fascinating about her is that she, like I said, she essentially functions as a Rebbe, but in so doing, she completely challenges the social norms of the time. We're talking about, I mean, so Shabtai Zvi allows women up to give Aliyah, right? Or to give an Aliyah. And then nothing happens for a couple hundred years. And then this happens just sort of organically out of the blue. And she completely pushes back against the patriarchal social norms of the time and forms her own, not Hasidic dynasty, because she doesn't have children, but a Hasidic movement, an actual Hasidic movement. All right. And I put here that she's financially independent and self-sufficient. If she were not financially independent, this wouldn't have happened, because not only are there very structured patriarchal norms that are happening in the Jewish world in Europe at the time, there's also very structured class norms. And we think to ourselves, wait a minute, I thought everyone was living like they lived in Fiddler on the Roof, right? And just scraping by and like wishing to be rich, right? As the song goes. And the answer, my response to that is no, that's not the case. There actually there are class hierarchies, and there are Jews, particularly in the Hasidic dynasties and in their inner circles, who are doing very well for themselves. And that is part of this story that comes into play. So what is the historical context here? That's Tsar Nicholas I, and he's part of this story. In Europe, throughout Europe, you have the Jewish question, which is being broached. What do we do with the Jews of Europe? Should the Jews of Europe be assimilated? Should we have a pluralistic society? Should we encourage them to leave? Should they go to Palestine? Should they go to, and again, I say Palestine because that's what it's called at the time. Should they go to America? What should be there's and this goes to its conclusion in the both the pogroms and in the 1940s. Should it be resolved with violence? So yeah, we're having questions about who we are, but also this is spurned by Europeans having questions about who we are and what they should quote unquote do with us, right? The Jewish question. And so in Russia, they're asking this question. So for centuries, Jews had lived in what's called the Pale of Settlement, which was basically the space between Western Europe and then like Western Russia. So Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, parts of Poland. This is where we had been for Ashkenazi Jews for the most part, after being expelled from Western Europe, had been for a number of centuries. And now Russian Gentiles are saying, well, what do we do with them now that they're here? And so Tsar Nicholas I has some interesting approaches to the Jewish question. And the question is, so what are some of the approaches? One could be a more passive approach, which is kind of how things were done in France, which is to say that we give all the Jews citizenship, but encourage them to be Jewish only in their homes, right? That was kind of the French approach, which if you know your French history, you know about Alfred Dreyfus, it didn't go all that well. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas favored basically a forced answer to the Jewish question, not forced in the Hitlerian sense that we got to get rid of them all, we got to exterminate, right? Not like that, but forced in like, what can we do to make sure that the Jews who are under our control ideally become Christian, ideally become not just Christian, but Orthodox Christian, and not just Orthodox Christian, but Russian. How do we make sure that they have a Russian identity? And that same idea is going to happen when the Soviets take over as well. Stalin is going to engage in the same sort of thinking. So how do we stop them from being Jewish and make them into Russians? And he comes up with this plan to conscript Jewish men into the armed services. And not for just a couple years, but if you were in the armed services in Russia during this time frame, you were in for 25 years. That was how long it was. So what Tsar Nicholas does is he lowers the age of conscription from 18 to 12, and he forms these canton schools, which are basically children would be taken from their families and they would be given over to the canton schools, where they would be very much encouraged to convert to Christianity, and then they'd be there for 6 years, and then they'd be in the army. And the vast majority of Cantonistas, right, of Cantonist soldiers, or of Jews who become Cantonists, the vast majority of them are just lost to the Jewish community forever, right? Just completely gone. Now, there was a way out of this. You could go to what's called a royal school, which meant that you were sent from 12 to 18 to a boarding school. You didn't have to go into the army, but you could, when you're 18, you could come home. But the only piece of people you would engage with were Orthodox priests. That's who's teaching you Judaism, right? So that was also the end of a Jewish identity. The other way out of this was to be wealthy and to pay a double tax, pay a lot of money, and then you didn't have to go in. To make things even worse was that the Russian government didn't randomly choose Jewish children. The Russian government went to these Hasidic rebbes who were like basically in charge of the Jewish communities there and said, you choose who's going to go. And so they would choose poor and disenfranchised kids to go. So none of their children ever went. And so this is creating a lot of disapproval and dismay and disenfranchisement with the Hasidic movement. And this whole time frame is seen as a decline of Hasidism. And so what happens is that out of this comes this individual, Hannah Rachel, who is able to be a charismatic leader. Did you have a question, Sarah?
No, going back to the comment you made, Lance made a comment like that's the phrase beyond the pale.
Yeah, so that's exactly when we say beyond the pale, we're talking about that's a reference to the Pale Settlement. Absolutely. All right. I'm not gonna read all through this. I'm gonna bore everyone to death, but I do just want to quickly touch on a couple things. The Hasidic Judaism initially is charismatic, so you have the Baal Shem Tov, who comes with this new way of engaging with mysticism. Hasidic Judaism is about dancing joyously, separated by gender, of course, but dancing joyously with Torah, engaging in the love of Torah, chanting a nigun, like a wordless melody. That would be an example of a nigun that's sort of invented by the Hasidim. This is and for the first couple of generations, specifically Baal Shem Tov and then Dov Ber of Mezorich, these two individuals are charismatic leaders, and in that are also very similar to Shabtai Zvi, are very similar to Frank, are very similar to Jesus, right? Charismatic religious leaders who start religious movements. But after that, it doesn't fall apart. After that, like it's not charismatic leaders, it becomes bureaucratic rather than charismatic, and the leaders are their children and their children's children, and it becomes dynastic. So by the fourth and fifth generation, you have these dynastic movements that are establishing actual royal courts of Hasidim, right? So the Rebbe will sit like a king or like a lord, and they'll actually have courts built, and Hasidic men will come during the holidays and pay deference and tribute to these rebbes, and they'll bring money, and the people will have to be taxed. And then the secular governments are okay with this, or rather the Russian governments are okay with this, because it's keeping the Jews in line, because people are shelling out tons of money over, and if you can't shell out money to the rebbes, then you run the risk of your kid getting sent off to the Canton schools, right? That's what's going on, right? So these courts and this bureaucracy is maintained through really oppressive taxes, and because of those taxes and because of the income and because of the lack of income with the poorer families, those are the ones who are being sent to Canton schools. And this is why people are becoming incredibly disillusioned and dismayed by this whole system. So out of this comes Hannah Rochel. And she, interestingly enough, is wealthy, but she's independently wealthy. And she's independently wealthy because she's an only child, and her father's wealthy, and she ends up inheriting the money. So she's not beholden to the rebbes. Now what do we know about her? We know what we know about her, we only know from what are called hagiographies or hagiographies, which are oftentimes it's referred, these are stories about saintly people, and they're stories about like the wonderful, miraculous deeds of saintly people. They're embellished, but they aren't really historically verifiable. But there's a number of hagiographies about her life, and because there's so many of them, there's some kernels of truth within them. So that's why we know a little bit about her. They oftentimes refer to having an unremarkable childhood, and then that's juxtaposed against her transformation into this Rebbe figure. She's an only child, so her father sends her to Cheder, which is like a Jewish school, like a kindergarten, basically. And then here's where it starts to get really interesting. There is a legend about who she married or who she didn't marry. So she never actually has like an long ongoing marriage, but there's all these stories about her kind of, like, I would say, yeah, she never actually marries, and there's lots of stories about that. Some historians think that she may have been today what we would call part of the LGBTQ community. She may have been a lesbian. This is sometimes like speculated, but we have really no evidence for that one way or the other. That's just speculation. Her stories, though, are fascinating. So there's two stories that are connected to her first attempt at marriage. The Chernobyl Rebbe and or her mother are said to have warned against forcing her to marry. So the story goes is that her father was told either by her mother or by the Chernobyl Rebbe, which is that this person is going to be special. You cannot force her to marry anyone without her consent. She has to marry whoever she wants to marry, which is also unheard of at the time, right? There's a degree of agency that's given to her, whether that actually was the case or not. At least in this legend, there's a degree of agency that's given to her that sort of sets her apart as special. So there's this warning, like she can't force her to marry anyone she doesn't want to marry. So she does want to marry, though. So who is it that she wants to marry? Well, there's three more stories, right? One is that it's some friend who she grew up with from childhood, some like who she's known her whole life, some boy who she's known her whole life. The other one is what's called an Essentag. So Essentag means room and board. So what would happen during this era, before there were formal yeshivas, before there were formal yeshivot, what would happen is that scholars or students would go from house to house and families would put them up. They would stay. If someone says, oh, where are you going to be on Shabbos? Oh, I'm staying by so-and-so on Shabbos. That comes from the idea that Jewish students would go and stay with someone in the local community. And so her betrothed was thought of, this other story was Essentag. He was someone who stayed with her family. And then the final story, right, is that this is a runaway Cantonist, someone who had left the Jewish community and is like basically Russian, right, for all intents and purposes. And what I find fascinating about these three stories, does that sound familiar to anyone? Like one betrothed or one possible betrothed individual who is her childhood friend, another one is someone from afar who's boarding with them, and the other one is connected to the Russian services. It sounds like Fiddler, right? Right? Yeah, it sounds exactly like Fiddler. I know that Saul Ansky, who wrote Der Dybbuk, he took from her story. I don't know if Sholem Aleichem did, but that's a pretty strong, but and also the warning, right? The mother's warning or the parents' someone's warning about don't let them marry someone who they're like. We have there's that whole scene in about Fruma Sarah, right? Fruma Sarah's warning. So I think that Sholem Aleichem, in the play, there's this scene. I wonder if this story was big enough that it would have affected that as well, because that definitely resonates with my knowledge of Fiddler, at least. All right. So when she is 12, she has this incident that brings about what she calls her higher soul. And lots of new religious movement leaders have these incidents. They have some sort of engagement with the sacred, right? Whether it is with this issue that happens with her, or whether it's Mary Baker Eddy who falls and hurts herself and then creates Christian Science, or whether it is Muhammad hearing Jibril in the wilderness, right? You have all sorts of these moments. And so her moment happens when she's 12, and she has what's an incident in a cemetery. So according to one of the stories, she is in the cemetery and she is asking her mother's grave, asking for permission to marry, right? So she's getting ready to start her life as the wife of whichever suitor it was that is the actual person, whether it's the Essentag or the Cantonist or whatever. And rather than like feeling that her mother from beyond has given her permission, she falls unconscious, maybe suffers an injury, maybe hits her head on the gravestone. But ultimately, as a result, has a spiritual experience that leads to a transformation. And a spiritual experience that basically tells her that she cannot get married. She has to call off the engagement. And it has what she refers to as a transformation. Now, the act of inviting or asking permission or inviting a relative who's passed on to a wedding, that was actually pretty common at the time. Lots of people would have done that. So so you would go to a cemetery and you would say, I want to invite you to the wedding. And it's actually from that that the speculation later comes on that she's possessed by a dybbuk. Do any of you know what a dybbuk is? Like, I know that we talked about it in our class years ago. You remember? Yeah. It's a devil or a mischievous spirit that possesses you. It possesses you. It's a Jewish possession story. Yeah, it could be. So usually it's somebody who it's a ghost who has some sort of unfinished business and is using you to finish that unfinished business, right? And so her detractors would say when she becomes this amazing Torah scholar, because what happens is that she falls, she injures herself, and as the story goes, suddenly she's just reciting Talmud, right? Never studied Talmud her life, although in reality probably did. But like the story is that she never studied Talmud, she never studied Torah, and suddenly she's just spouting whole pages of Talmud that even the most learned Rebbes are unable to do, right? She's just knows all the things. And so people are asking, well, how can she know this? How can this woman know all this stuff? It's not that she studied it when she was younger and that her parents said her to cheder. That's not the case. It's that there must be a dybbuk, right? There must be a malevolent spirit who has possessed her and has not just tricked her into or caused her to to say Talmud, or to talk Talmud, but also has gotten her off the path of being married, right? That's the implication, is that she's gotten off this necessary path. But in any event, whatever happened, whether it was a Dybbuk or an Ibur, which is actually, it's like a good Dybbuk. It's a spirit that, if the idea is that like Rabbi Akiva possessed her or something, right? So a learned rabbi or a tzaddik or something possesses you in order to do something good in the world, like to engage in tikkun olam from the mystical perspective, which is to teach Torah to everybody. Or whether it was a malevolent spirit. The idea is that no, she couldn't possibly have done this on her own. But that doesn't really matter to her. She does call off her wedding and she devotes her life to prayer and study. And so for her teen years, all she does is study. She lives a pretty ascetic lifestyle. She wanders around. She wanders around her community and she studies Torah. And that's pretty much her life as a teenager, right? So I have these, I'm not going to show these. We don't have time to show these clips, but I encourage you to look them up. I just did a quick, the Dybbuk in Jewish art. It's a very, very common motif. This is from Asera, from Fiddler on the Roof. And from Asera very much is, if not a Dybbuk itself, she definitely comes back to, I mean, she doesn't really come back. Tevye makes her up, right? But the idea is he's able to convince his wife that that this is real, because basically she's visits in a dream, and so she basically becomes a sort of a Dybbuk. But the idea of the Dybbuk comes from not just folklore, but Saul Ansky writes Der Dybbuk. It becomes a movie in 1937, which is about a woman who is about to be married. She goes to the graveyard to invite or to talk to her former beloved who has died. She's going to be married to someone else, and her former beloved inhabits her, right? It possesses her. And so Saul Ansky almost certainly took from the story of Hana Rachel when he created Der Dybbuk, both the play and then later a Polish movie. If you've ever seen A Serious Man, Joel and Ethan Coen, this is a 2008 movie. It's very, very good. You should check it out. There's a Dybbuk scene in that. And then, of course, from Asera in Fiddler on the Roof. Okay. Oh, this is the women of the wall who are laying tefillin. That's important. I have them up there, not to make, talk politically about the women of the wall, although we should have a conversation about them at some point. But basically, because Hana Rachel was one of the first women to intentionally lay tefillin. She wore talit, she laid and wrapped tefillin, and that was a big scandal at the time. Still is a big scandal. I'm going to be, it's not really a scandal in the Reform movement. In fact, we're going to be doing a lesson on laying tefillin later in the year for our sixth grade through ninth grade students. But outside of Reform and conservative Judaism, that's a big no-no, right? Not just for basically to have our female students laying tefillin. So like she does that, and that creates a whole lot of scandal. But in any event, she devotes her life to study, and her life is reflective of this. It's actually, there's a syncretic thing happening where there's a parallel movement in Russian Orthodoxy called, let me see if I pronounce this right, Khenitskiki, right? So basically, these are non-clergy ascetic women. So these are Russian women who don't want to be married, and also don't want to become nuns in the Russian Orthodox Church. And instead, they become wandering ascetics who dress in all black and preach and study Russian Orthodoxy. So Hana Rachel, who would have been familiar with these women, she does a similar thing. She dresses, I don't know if she dresses in all black, but she wanders around studying Torah. And then, but slowly begins to establish followers. People start following her because she begins to expound on her studies, and she's very charismatic. And around the time that she is in her early 20s, her father dies, and her mother has already died, and she's an only child. So her father leaves to her a large sum of money, a significant sum of money that allows her to be basically completely financially independent without having a husband, without being connected to the rabbinic courts, to the Hasidic courts, without any sort of other ties. She just has money and a decent sum of it. So she decides to create her own Beis Midrash, or Beit Midrash in Sephardic, base in Ashkenaz, which is a shul. right? It's a school and a synagogue. She creates a little synagogue. So if you we actually right now are sitting in the base midrash of CBT, right? The synagogue library is the place of learning. I guess the religious school would be too. So she creates basically a school of studying Torah above a bunch of shops in Ludmir, and also there's like a synagogue component to it as well. And yeah, so she's able to do that. Question so far.
Are her followers mostly women?
Excellent question. And here we go. Yes, no, excuse me. Her followers are men and women, but she's very, very sharp, and she knows what she can do to get it, what she can get away with under the control of the Rebbe of Chernobyl and the other Hasidic Rebbes. Like what, because they wield significant political control. So she threads the needle in a really well. She has this charismatic component, and she behaves like a Rebbe, and she teaches Torah to men and women, but she keeps the synagogue separate. She has a mechitza. There are separate domains within the synagogue. But even then, she'll push the limit. So very famously on Simchat Torah, she kicks all the men out, and she has the women come dance with the Torah, right? Which was a really big deal. But ultimately, she doesn't have them do it at the same time. So, and she doesn't, I believe that she teaches Torah to men and women, but she isn't calling women up for aliyot. So she still establishes some gender borders. That's still there because she has to fly under the radar of the Rebbe of the region. So she creates these separate synagogue domains. She establishes a tish. A tish is what we're doing right now, right? A tish in Yiddish and German means a table. And so what a Rebbe would do, not to say that I'm like a Rebbe, what a Rebbe would do is that, and this is still the case, if you go to like a Hasidic household, you go to like someone who was in Chabad for dinner, the rabbi of the family, usually like the male head of household, will sit at the table and will discuss Torah, right? And they would do it around a table. But it was informal, and that's what made it so. At least initially, it was more informal compared to the mitnagim, the non-Hasidic Jews who did a very formal synagogue way. Initially Hasidism was informal, and so the idea of a tish where you learn Torah was like a thing. And so Hana Rachel establishes a tish where everyone would sit around the table. In this particular case, because it was informal learning, it would usually, if she would either do it for men or women, or but she wouldn't do it like in mixed company, or if she was doing a formal lecture that men and women were attending, she would sit outside like the room. Like, so she'd be like, we all be in here, and she'd be right out there giving the lecture. So that was how she sort of established these gender separations. Yeah. She received prayer requests, and this is something that Hasidic Rebbe still receive today. People ask them to pray for pray for my family, pray for my husband, pray for my cousin, whatever the case may be. People give Rebbe's prayer requests. She received prayer requests, and she would offer blessings to, if you were in need of a blessing, if you were in need of a Misha Berach, she could give those blessings. But supposedly she was able to like perform miracles. Supposedly, according to legend, she could do healings, she could like manifest divine presence, all sorts of things like that. So because of her knowledge in the spiritual world, and because of her supposed ability to perform miracles, it wasn't just Jewish women who sought out her advice and her miracles. Supposedly Christians also sought her out for blessings as well. Now this is a rumor. Eventually, when she moves to Israel, Muslim women will seek her out, right? And that's actually recorded. Whether or not Christian women sought her out, that's up for debate. Daryl.
That's pretty interesting question in general. We think of Christian and Jew as being very clearly distinct religious philosophies and not really compatible with each other. But I have the feeling when it comes to Muslim and Jew, and we can throw in Maori and everybody else in the world, their religious philosophies sort of overlap. Am I right?
I mean, I think you're asking if there's like patriarchy sort of across the board, and yeah, there is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it wouldn't be incompatible for a Jew to be praying with a Muslim or a Muslim with a Jew,
Mm.
other than the social structure and the.
I mean, there are theological components, sure,
Yeah.
but yeah. Okay, so I know we're running out of time. I want to quickly finish the story. So I won't, again, I'll sort of breeze through this really quickly. Ultimately, this ends up threatening the power of the Rebbe's in the region. They are, if people start flocking to her and she's not charging them money to attend, right, or to go to her court, and she's not wielding her power to protect her dynasty, because she doesn't have a dynasty, then why should anyone listen to these Rebbe's, who already people aren't listening to them because they're sending their children off to the Canton schools? So their power is already diminishing. So if this is the case, that she needs to be dealt with. And so the Rebbe's of the region decide that they're going to find a way to deal with her. And the way that they do that is to force her to get married. So the Chernobyl Rebbe shows up at her shul, and she receives him. Before that, she actually would send away prominent Jews. She'd say, no, I'm too humble to meet with you, right? And she'd send away prominent Jews, but she receives the Chernobyl Rebbe because he actually has clout and power and has control over the lives of the Jews in her region. So Hannah Rachel meets with him. They supposedly debate for 3 days about whether or not she should be married. And she ultimately agrees to marry, and she marries her gabbai. You all know what a gabbai is?
The one that checks while you're reading Torah. to
Yeah,
make sure you don't
the
make a
gabbai is
mistake.
a bima assistant, basically. So they'll hold the in our case the Plaut commentary, but sometimes it's also referred to as a chumash, which is a book of Torah. They'll follow along and make sure, yeah, exactly, that you
They
don't make a
correct
mistake.
you.
And-
Not in form as much, but
Yeah.
I've seen that.
Yeah, they'll correct you in Orthodox settings,
Yeah.
absolutely. So she has a gabbai and she marries her gabbai, but never consummates the marriage. And the marriage itself, depending on who you ask, lasts 3 days or 1 day. It depends on the story. And the question is, why doesn't she consummate the marriage? Aside from the fact that she probably wasn't heterosexual, right? That's like that we don't know that for sure, but that's probably a big reason. So what are the reasons? Well, the first reason, I love this reason, the gabbai was too intimidated, right? The gabbai's like, oh, this is the Ludmira Moy, this is the maiden of Ludmir, this is the great and spiritual holy Hannah Rachel. How could I possibly do such a thing, right? That's the first reason, and so he just it's not consummated. The second reason is that the Chernobyl Rebbe has come to her and accused her of being a Sabbatean, basically, and saying you're engaging in antinomial behavior by not marrying. You are flouting the law. You're saying you're not flouting the law, but you are. You're flouting the law. You need to stop and you need to get married. So she follows the letter of the law. She gets married, but doesn't stay married. So she asks for a get immediately, and her gabbai gives her a get. A get is a Jewish divorce, and the marriage is dissolved within a number of days. And then the third reason is that she gets married, but she doesn't seek a get. She doesn't get a divorce, which render her in Orthodox Judaism. If you don't, if you're a woman and you don't receive a get, you become what's called aguna, which is like a shunned woman, and you can never be married again. And so there's this actual serious issue in Orthodoxy where women try to get divorced and their husbands don't give them a get. And so the Jewish community and some of these Hasidic communities like send like other like Hasidic men to rough up the husband to force them to give a get, right? It's actually like on all many levels, this is a serious problem in many Orthodox communities, or Hasidic communities, I should say. But in her case, if this is the case, if she doesn't get a get, she's aguna, but she wants to be aguna. She wants to be a shunned woman because that means everyone will leave her alone about being married. In any event, the marriage is dissolved, and but when this happens, she says that her higher soul leaves her. She stops preaching. She stops holding a court at a Bet Midrash. In fact, the Chernobyl Rebbe and his court move in and take over the building, and they completely take over, and things return to normal, as it were, whatever normal is at that time. And she moves into obscurity, and we don't know what she does for 2 decades. Is she wandering around? We're not sure. Is she living just in the community? We don't know. Is she living in the Midrash and she just allowed a space there? We don't know that, because all of this is based on hagiography like 20 years after her death. But we do know that at the age of 53, she moves to Jerusalem. And like that's actually quite remarkable. We don't know what caused her to do it, although there's evidence that like the when she was forced to marry, the Rebbe was like, you either need to marry or you need to go make Aliyah, right? Well, she doesn't do it for 20 years, but at 53 she moves to Mea Shearim, which is the ultra Orthodox community in Jerusalem today is. And that's remarkable. Think about that. We're talking about in the middle of the 18th century, 1860, give or take. At the age of 53, no airplanes or anything like that, she picks up and she moves from Poland, or not from Poland, from Ukraine to Israel, right? To Jerusalem. That's where she goes. And she starts preaching again. She starts talking Torah again. She starts teaching Torah, and she gains a following. And this time she gains a following among Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. She's probably almost certainly just speaking all in Yiddish, because Hebrew has not been fully reconstructed as a non-liturgical language. It's probably in Yiddish and probably being translated into Arabic or Ladino. But she starts preaching and gains a following, and people start seeking her out again for her wisdom when it comes to Torah and Talmud. In Jerusalem, she begins laying tefillin and wrapping herself in talit again, which when you know what's going on, like with the women of the wall who try to do this at the wall, like that's still controversial now in that city, which is remarkable and tragic. But she's doing this in 1860. She takes women on pilgrimage to Rachel's tomb in Hebron. That's that right there. So Kaver Rachel. I think that's how you say. Did I say get that right? Yes. Okay. That's where the matriarch Rachel is supposedly buried, and she has Tish sessions there. She gives Devar Torah in front of the tomb, and then she starts working miracles again. And supposedly Muslim and Arab women seek her out as well, in order to get cures for their children who are sick. And she ends up dying with a degree of notoriety, or being relatively well known, and she's recorded in a Jerusalem census as Harabbanit Hatzedeket B'mishpachat, which essentially means Rabbanit, right? Which essentially may mean female rabbi, the righteous one, like a tzaddik. A tzaddik, so not just a rebbe, but a tzaddik. I don't know if any of you have seen The Chosen or read The Chosen by not the new one about Jesus, but the Chaim, the Chaim Potok novel, right, about these unlikely friends, modern Orthodox young man and a Hasidic young man, and the Hasidic young man is like destined to become not just the Rebbe of this Hasidic family, but also a tzaddik. A tzaddik is a truly righteous individual, someone who possibly is like, there's again mystical connotations about this person, a tzaddik. If there's 36 of them, they help usher in the Messiah. Without getting too much in detail, that's a big deal. That is not insignificant to be called a tzaddik.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And so she is called a tzaddik, basically, Hatzedeket, right? The righteous one from a wealthy family. And that's how we know, or from an elevated family, that's how we know that it might be her. It's her name. She's given this title, this individual who's buried on the Mount of Olives is given this title of Rabbanit, and then a reference to her family, which we know was a well-to-do family. And that's the story of Chana Rachel, the Ludmira Moed. I want to say she was in her 80s. Yeah. Yeah. 70s or 80s. Yeah. Something like that. I don't know exactly. A fascinating story. Fascinating story. All right.
If there's any chance of those 2 decades that she was missing, that she was living privately with maybe another female.
That's a great question. So Suzanne asks if she was possibly living privately with another woman during those 2 decades. There's no way to know. As far as I know, there's no way to know. But I mean, that's definitely a very interesting speculation, and not outside the realm of possibility, except for the fact that unless it was truly, like, if they were like really living off the beaten path, maybe, but if she was living in Ludmir or Chernobyl, that would have been noticed. Yeah. And that would have given the Rebbe's ample opportunity, not just to like ostracize her, but to actually like, excommunicate her.
Yeah.
Right. Terrible. Yeah. Any other questions? Or
I'd
comments?
just like to say something about the Chosen. When I first saw it for the very first time, I didn't like it at all. It was boring to me. Somehow, something caught on to me, and I saw it again and again and again. I loved it so much.
Yeah, it's a good film.
From not liking it to loving it.
Yeah, it's a great film. I love it too. I love the book as well. Okay, so we will end it there for the day, but we will be back on our actual track, and because we'll have the choir members, which is half the class basically. They will be back next week, and we're going to talk about messianic adornment. So basically, messianic. When we're talking about like Jews for Jesus, right? That type of group for our new members today. Basically their talits, right? Their tzitzit that they use, their kippot, their mezuzot. So any type of like Judaica that we would think of as being part of normative Judaism, they have a version of it. And sometimes it's odd, sometimes it's aggravating, but what it is not is uninteresting. So I know we went deep into Jewish history today, and that's not how the class is advertised. We are definitely going back to talking about more contemporary American religion and Judaism within American religion next week. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So back to the
All right. Bye everyone online.
the 1800s Poland.